By now, unless you've been stranded on a deserted island, you know the story of the Oceanic 6.
Based on the location of the wreckage, our best estimate of the crash site is here.
How Kate and Aaron Austin, Sayid Jarrah, Sun Quan, Hugo Reyes, and Jack Shepard miraculously survived the crash of Flight 815 off the coast of Bali. How ocean currents carried them to a deserted island called Membata. How they survived for 108 days before they paddled a raft to the island of Sumba, where they were discovered, rescued, and airlifted to Honolulu.
I present to you the survivors of Oceanic 815.
This is their story. A story that has made the Oceanic 6 both international celebrities and absurdly wealthy. A story so incredible, so completely improbable, that quite frankly we all assume it has to be true. Or is it? Could this unbelievable story be just that, unbelievable? Could the Oceanic 6 be at the center of one of the greatest conspiracies in recent history? And if they are, who or what are they trying to protect? Let's start by looking at their official story. 8 adults survived what was, at best, the attempted emergency landing of a Boeing 777 in open water, a fact most of us take at face value. But in December 2002, Global Economy magazine reported that in the entire history of aviation, the number of wide-bodied jets that have made successful landings on water is 0. Bill Walduck is a professor of safety science at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and the world's leading authority on aircraft crashes.
And typically, if you have a high angle impact, usually from some form of loss of control of the airplane, for whatever reason, the water itself becomes incompressible. It's as solid as concrete if you hit it at the right angle at the right velocities. So what it's going to tend to do is shatter the structure in the airplane. So literally, you may have thousands and millions of pieces.
The only comparable water landing in recent history is that of Valet Air Flight 101, which crashed in the Atlantic while attempting to land at Keflavik International Airport. The force was so great on impact that more than 2 million pieces of debris were salvaged from the wreckage site. All but one of the bodies were so disfigured that they had to be identified through dental records, fingerprints, and DNA.
Airplanes that have wing-mounted engines, like the 767, 777, the engine pods themselves actually hang down below the lower part of the fuselage. As the pods dig in, you pitch into a deep ocean swell, it's going to shatter the fuselage. Now, this is a good example of an airplane that might be traveling 100 to 120 miles an hour, impacting the ground and fragmenting. If you hit the water at a high angle, this would be the sort of effect it should have on the airplane.
Now look at these images, broadcast to the world as the wreckage of Oceanic Flight 815, found at the bottom of the Sunda Trench by the Christiane 1, approximately 2 months after the crash. As reported, the wreckage appears to be nearly intact.
We've got an intact tail. We've got a major fracture just forward of the horizontal stabilizer, yet the rest of the fuselage is laying right in front of the tail. That would be unlikely as well. Won't see too much impact damage at all on the front end.
In addition, the debris in these images looks to have settled in a relatively contained geographic area. In stark contrast, debris and body parts from Flight 101 were collected from an area of well over 60 square miles.
You go through a few miles worth of depth, you should have a scatter pattern that might be 100 miles across. There's no way you'd see the parts of the airplane this close to each other over 4 miles down. If I were to come up on these by myself, it looks like either a junkyard or a stage set.
If what we are looking at is not the wreckage of an airline crash, but instead staged pieces of debris that have been rolled off a ship, whose bodies are those sitting in the seats? The following is an interview with an operator who worked for the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board's Oceanic hotline. Her voice and likeness have been disguised for her protection.
Well, I took a call from this guy, and he just seemed really agitated. He kept asking to speak to my supervisor, and I wanted to know why. And then he started yelling something about how the footage he's watching on TV, there's no way that the pilot could have been the real pilot from Flight 815. All I know is what he directly said to me.
Typically at that type of depth, the temperature, it's like being in a refrigerator. It's going to tend to slow the decomposition processes way down. But the biggest threat usually in terms of changing the body is the sea life. It's amazing even at those types of depths how much life there is down there. And those are going to be the ones that are going to begin to change the body, typically from feeding behaviors. It doesn't look typical of a body that would have been sitting at that depth for that period of time.
Conveniently, the one piece of debris the Christian 1 was unable to find was the black box, the single piece of evidence that could prove whether or not this is in fact a wreckage of Oceanic Flight 815 is missing.
Normally, in most Boeing airplanes, they're located back in the tail of the airplane, just behind the aft-pressure bulkhead. Typically, if we can find the tail of the airplane, then the boxes should be still attached to their mounts. It's a relatively easy process, even with an ROV, to go in and open the hatch, the access hatch, and unmount them and bring them back to the surface.
But let's assume for a moment that these images were not staged, that this is where Flight 815 crashed. The most obvious question then becomes, why was Flight 815 so off course? How did it end up over 1,000 miles in the opposite direction of its route to Los Angeles? The answer may lie at the bottom of the Sunda Trench. With a maximum depth of 4.8 miles, the Sunda Trench is one of the most inaccessible places on Earth. Far beyond the reach of any salvage attempt, Flight 815 could not have crashed in a worse place for investigators, which, not so coincidentally, makes it the perfect place for it to have crashed if your intent was to conceal the truth. A second possible explanation for the inexplicable location of the wreck relates to the geography of the land above the Sunda Trench. According to a 2002 survey by the National Institute of Aeronautics and Space, Indonesia is comprised of 18,306 islands. The Indonesian government estimates that over 6,000 of these islands are uninhabited, undiscovered, and unnamed. If you were going to have 6 survivors disappear for 108 days, what better place on Earth could you find? A place that makes the verification of the Oceanic 6's whereabouts physically impossible. But let's imagine for a moment that Oceanic 815 did crash in the Indian Ocean as reported here. How did the Oceanic 6 end up here, in this area, northeast of the crash site? According to the official story, they were carried by ocean currents.
We have special instruments that are actually current meters, and we also can derive measurements of the surface currents from satellite-based measurements. In that region, I had a set of moorings out in Lombok and Ombai, which are northwest and east of Sumba, and the currents were strongly towards the west during September in 2004. Based on our measurements, it would be impossible to float towards the east during September of 2004.
As to the fate of the other 3 initial survivors of the crash, only the Oceanic 6 know the truth. And they are not talking. No attempt has been made to recover their remains. And when thousands of Charlie Pace's fans asked Oceanic Air to help them locate Mimbata to build a memorial, they were met with an official runaround. Why? If the 6 are not flat out lying about the identities of the other 3, then they are at least suppressing information about their fate. Information some speculate might relate to how the 6 stayed in such top physical condition on the island. These photos have been printed and broadcast around the world as the very first images of the Oceanic 6 emerging from the sea. But ask yourself, do these people look like they've been stranded on an island for 108 days, living off coconuts and fish?
They would have the fish, which is difficult to catch, and the coconut, which is high in fat. But what they're missing is carbohydrate. And when a person is missing that, they end up burning their own fat stores for energy. And so therefore they lose weight. And once they lose their fat stores and become very lean, then they go into their protein stores, which is their muscle mass, and they begin wasting. And so you would have a great deal of loss. I'd say at least 25% in 3 months' time, which is 108 days, or more.
If you compare these images from airport surveillance cameras taken on the day of the crash with these photos taken on the day of the rescue, it appears as if none of them lost significant weight. Which raises the question, did they have another source of food?
There's no way to maintain their body weight with just fish and coconuts. They